I can't imagine there's anybody in here who doesn't know Dr. Bull, but Dr. Bull is our Assistant Vice President for Academics over the online and the center deliveries, and newly named Innovation Guru, and also an Associate Professor in the School of Education. So we welcome you and look forward to your presentation.
So those who are in Ann Arbor, some of this is not new. I went through some of this. We did a full day workshop on this theme. I've been talking about this theme in many different ways. The broad title I've been using is Learning Beyond Letter Grades, because this is part of a book that I've had rejected from 3 publishers so far. That no one wants to publish a book on assessment because they all have like dozens of them. So I have a colleague over at Pearson Education who told me I just need to call it feedback and then people will take it. So I'm going to try that. I'm going to send it once more to the publishers. But I've led some workshops around the country for K-12 and higher ed audiences and different groups around just concepts of really we're talking about helping students see their learning progress, but it's really, you know, a fancy way of getting at the role of formative assessment and formative feedback in our classes. So that's what we're going to take a look at here. But before we dive in, I'd love to get a sense of maybe what you came for. When you came into this event today or when you signed up, what was it that captured your interest and what is it that you hope to take away from our time together today? And the Ann Arbor people, I think you can actually type in the, type and we can see your responses. She's running around with the microphone so everyone can hear her on the other side.
One of the things that I've been trying to focus on is helping students be aware of what they're learning in the classroom. So I'm not getting comments at the end of the semester like we didn't learn anything in this class, when I've seen, you know, on assessments that they have been learning, but they don't seem to be aware of what they're learning. So that's been something I've been trying to focus on.
Okay.
I'm so glad to hear that other people have the same issue. Trying to figure out and trying to understand how to help students see that assignments are not just assignments, but there's a purpose and what it is they're learning beyond the goals on the syllabi.
Okay. So seeing what people learn beyond just kind of the syllabi, and it's more than just kind of completing an assignment, what they're learning as a result of the assignment. Is that accurate? Okay. Mm-hmm. She sees you, I think.
Helping to see students see where they're deficient, so they have to take on their own ownership. Right?
Yes.
I get a pretty constant request from my students for feedback, for timely and relevant feedback, and so I think I was hoping for another avenue besides just their general assessments, and obviously just the verbal cueing I give them to try and alert them to where they're at.
Okay, very good. Mm-hmm.
This is probably pretty specific, but just the idea about the Blackboard management tool, and you show them grades with the lowest grades dropped already during the semester, or you wait and they kind of get a bonus when those grades get dropped at the end of the semester.
Okay.
Sure, so if we have 10 quizzes and I drop the lowest grade, do I factor that into the Blackboard running total?
Yeah. Okay, good. Anything else? So, okay.
So from CUAA, how to help students self-regulate their learning based on classroom assessments.
Okay, great. So the things that I heard were students are not always aware of what they're learning, and so sometimes that shows up even at the end of course evaluation where they don't feel like they learned that much, but they might have. They just haven't recognized what they learned in the course, right? Another one was just helping students see beyond that there's actually something they're learning as a result of the assignments, um, and helping students see their own limitations or their own deficiencies or where they're not learning, notice those gaps, and then hopefully make some adjustments to that. Another one is timely and relevant feedback, that's something that we get assessed on, but how can we build a more robust kind of feedback mechanism that also allows us to still get some sleep, right? And there was a specific one about Blackboard, so thinking about how I communicate feedback to them and in Blackboard using the tools and what's going to be most effective. And then the broad one about self-regulation. Okay, so that's great. I think we're on track because those are the kinds of things that I'd intended to tackle with this conversation today. I will share, I have a few biases. We learn too late that our convictions matter, one of my mentors said, and so I always like to put those out there. I certainly have some strong convictions about learning, and I actually have another book that's hopefully will be finished by the end of this month. I got those 3 months ago, but it went into my junk file, so I emailed them last week saying, hey, are you going to accept this book? And they said, we did accept it 3 months ago, and it's due in a month. So I will have that book finished. But it's on the topic of self-directed learning, and I'm convinced that that's a real issue that we're experiencing more and more in our K-12 and our higher ed institutions, and actually in a broader society, that in a society where people don't have a strong sense of self-regulation and self-direction, it can set us up for, well, it's hard for a democracy to even thrive in that kind of a context or environment. We need people who have a sense of agency, and they believe that their choices matter, and they can self-regulate, right? So this is a great place. I mean, so what we're teaching, it certainly has implications for the content that we're teaching in our classes, but I believe it has even larger implications in our society. So I'm coming from that sort of assumption. And really, as we get into this, we're really talking about creating feedback mechanisms and loops. And oftentimes, I actually did a study of syllabi in higher education courses. I collected syllabi from about 8 to 10 different universities. And I studied them, and I looked based upon what's in the syllabus. How do the learners know how they're doing? Like if I'm in this class, is there any evidence, at least from the syllabus? And it's a little unfair because the syllabus doesn't, people don't always include everything in the syllabus, right? But how would I know how I'm doing in this class? And then I'd also ask a couple of other fun questions like, what's the highest possible grade someone could get in this class while knowing very little? And what's the lowest possible grade someone could get while knowing a great deal? And I would evaluate their assessment plan with those questions in mind, in the syllabus. And it was really eye-opening to me. And as I began to interview some of the faculty to get a little bit of insight behind the syllabus, I found that there were quite a few faculty that weren't really even thinking about feedback. They were thinking more about grading, thinking about, I'm going to give them a grade, issue them a grade, and I'll just kind of leave the rest to them. And while we certainly want them to develop this capacity for self-regulation, many of them are just not ready for that, is what we're finding, right? I mean, you've probably all seen this. And so we have a lot of people who, students, when you interview the students in these classes, their frustration is they feel like they're being told to shoot at a target and they're blindfolded. And they don't know if they're close to the target or they're off from the target. All they know is they're getting certain grades. And they don't really know what that grade means or and what it doesn't mean. And maybe we think they should know what it means, but the reality is we're finding that it doesn't. So the question that we're really going to tackle here is, well, how can we overcome that? How can we actually, are there some design considerations in our classes that can help us get at this a little bit? So I've selected 4, I think it's 4, that we're going to try to tackle together today. We're going to talk about some that are, I realize, a lot more time consuming for us as faculty, but then others that can help you manage your time. We'll talk about narrative feedback. We'll talk about self-feedback. We'll talk about peer feedback. We'll talk a little bit about portfolio feedback systems. And I think I threw 1 or 2 others in there that I can't remember right now. But we'll see where the conversation takes us. So I love to start with this. Those who've heard me talk on assessment before, I share this. it's a little bit unfair. This William Farish was a Christian man, a Cambridge math tutor, and his name has been really defamed, and I'm going to help defame it a little bit more right now. Probably unfairly. It's a little bit, we're not sure how accurate this historical account is, but William Farish was a Cambridge math tutor, and in Cambridge, for Cambridge tutors, you would get paid by the student. And it was a really time-consuming thing to have students submit their work and to go through and to carefully assess it. Narrative feedback was the primary means by which people would give feedback at the time. And writing all of that was just time-consuming. And he couldn't take on as many students. And that, in return, impacted his salary. So he decided, he's a math guy, so he decided to come up with a more mathematical or symbolic way of representing students' learning. So he came up with this clever idea of a letter grade system. And so he would issue students grades on the basis of their performance, which is, some people argue, is the origin of our letter grade system. It started with this math tutor in Cambridge, and then it was in the 1800s that it started finding its way into U.S. universities. It's interesting that, we're talking about less than 200 years of actually even using the letter grade system that many of us assume is sort of integral to education, and it's not. And it just varies from different parts of the world. There are different uses of letter grades. Some don't actually use A, B, C, D, F. They use numbers or different letters and things like that. But it's all shorthand. And for learners, it's really an abstraction. So the letter grade, it's hard for a lot of learners to really translate what that letter grade actually means about what they've learned and what they've not learned, and where their weaknesses are and where their strengths reside, right? So what we're trying to get at here with this feedback system is trying to help our students make this shift from what I'd call a culture of earning, where it's really about what do I need to do to get the grade, to starting to make some progress toward students seeing this as a culture of learning, where they generally are interested in what they have learned and what they haven't learned, and how they need to grow and how they need to develop, right? And we all want that. That's a much more fun and engaging and enjoyable and fulfilling teaching experience when we have students who are thinking about the class in that way, and it's not just about getting the grade. But we do have some obvious challenges. I talked to a few colleagues from here about this conversation they've been having with students, and all of them talked about how when they'd ask students a question like, what's the purpose of this class? And many students could not get past answering in the form of grades. The purpose of this class is to get a good grade. No, what's the real purpose here? What do you need to get out of this class? I need to get a good grade out of this class, the students would reply. And I don't know, maybe you can relate with this a little bit. Have you seen that with some of your students? So that's obviously much more a culture of earning, and students are thinking about what hoops do I have to jump through, what criteria do I need to meet, what do I need to check off my list. So the purpose of a letter grade is interesting, and I'll just stop and see what you think about this. What do you consider to be the purpose of a letter grade? Okay, helps you create a GPA. All right. We're using the microphone, even though it's not projecting in the room, it's going to our Ann Arbor friends.
The way we thought it should show that the students have certain caliber of information necessary.
Okay. So it should, hopefully, our grades are somehow attached to their performance in the class or their mastery. Just coming for you.
I would say that it's a scientific measure of information rather than communication of actual learning.
Okay. Tell me a little bit more about that. Unpack that for us.
There are various types of things that students are required to learn. And very often this comes in the form of information, whether that's to diagram a cell or be able to explain on a piece of paper how Christians have talked about the Trinity, these sorts of things. This is part of that basic form of information. But information is what computers do,
Yeah.
and not what human beings do.
Okay. All right. Got it. Okay. So, the letter grade system, and this is where, as I started looking at this more and more over the years, I found that many of us, we have our, yes.
I
Oh,
just
you have
a
another
comment
one
from
from
CUAA,
CUAA.
to discriminate between levels of performance.
Okay, discriminate between levels of performance. All right, very good. But this is where when I look at a lot of course designs, we start to fall short. We have a grading plan in place, right? We've figured out in our class, here's what you need to do in order to earn this grade, and this grade. And most of us have something like that figured out. But we don't always take as much time to create feedback plans. Like, how do I design this class in a way that people can see how they're doing? Am I close to the target or am I far off? And how do we do that early enough that it's not too late for students, right? In a lot of grading plans, the first time that students, especially in many university courses, the first time that a student gets a substantive insight into how they're performing in the class is like at a midterm. And so the best they can do is maybe a B in some cases. Is it possible, and I don't know about you, but my goal is for students to finish the class with the highest level of performance possible. I want them to have learned as much as possible out of it, right? And not to mention the fact that our grading plans aren't always equitable. Let's imagine two students in a biology class. One student comes from a family. One's a medical doctor, the other a marine biologist. They grew up, like every vacation in this home was like a science trip, right? They did something, they'd go and they'd learn to, they'd collect, they'd conduct research with their parents in the Caribbean, or they do something fun like that and interesting. And so they grew up in a home of science geeks, and they learned to think science from the time that they were speaking, right? And this person goes into this bio class and sits right next to another person who aspires to be a doctor one day, and she just happens to come from a family that they weren't scientists. In fact, she's the first one to ever go to college, and she worked hard in school, and she comes in, and she's going to work her rear end off in that class. But she doesn't come with a lot of prior knowledge or background. So the two of them are sitting in that class, and the first assessment in the class is hard for the one who doesn't have the background, because it's going to take her time to learn the vocabulary and just get in the swing of things. And so she doesn't perform very well in terms of grades, but that grade is permanent. It's going to show up in her final course grade, right? The other one, she really didn't even have to prepare for that first quiz because, well, she knew this stuff growing up, and she just knew the vocabulary, and she was very familiar with it. But as time goes on, the one student with the family background, she coasts a little bit. She coasts, and she doesn't study quite as much because she knows the stuff. She knows she can get through it. The other student works harder and harder and harder and uses every bit of feedback to try to improve and grow. But when you look at their end grades, it's very possible that the one who had the prior background has a higher letter grade than the other one. But if you actually assess their learning, you might find that the one with less of a background actually learned more in the class, maybe even is at a higher level of mastery than the other person. It's just how the letter grades, it's just how the grading plan was created in the course, right? So we do have some of those challenges, and I'm not going to suggest that we solve all of those here together, but I'll just address grades very quickly, and then we'll go on to the main part of our conversation. So proposed benefits, some people see grades as a great motivator. Actually, I'll remove grade. Some people see it as a motivator. Varies who you are, whether you think it's a good one or not. People often say, especially if I talk to people in the K-12 level, or you're in undergrad and we're thinking about grad school someday, well, the previous level uses them, so we use them too, because just have to respect the system. It's the key to academic rigor. Whenever I've interviewed people, many people believe that that's it. The way that I have rigor in my class is by being more difficult in how I grade, which I'm going to challenge a little bit. I'm not convinced that that's always the secret to rigor. Compare performances across organizations, which I also challenge that one, because getting a B in a writing class at Concordia, Wisconsin is not necessarily comparable to getting a B in a writing class at another university. We just don't know if the faculty necessarily have the same standard or anything, right? So we accept the transfer of grades from one institution to the next, but we honestly don't really know what the grade means. That's just kind of the world we live in, right? And then there's that final argument, which is they work fine, so why change them? And I'm not actually arguing that we change grades, just that we supplement them with some other stuff. I would argue that there are some questionable uses of grades. The punishment approach, that's kind of no one's prepared, so I'm going to give a pop quiz. Everyone take out a blank sheet of paper, and I will give you the consequence of not being prepared. And so they're going to get a lower grade. I'm not sure that that really helps accomplish much in our class, or that I'm not sure that it helps with the concept of what a grade is supposed to mean, right? As a carrot, a judgment of student ability and commitment to academic excellence. That's a controversial one, but the more I look at this, the less I'm convinced that the grade is the only measure here. In fact, it might be a measure of how good of a student someone is in a very traditional sense, but we've all had those deeply curious students who love content in our course. They aren't necessarily as good of a student in the traditional sense, but they are probably very committed to academic excellence in one, maybe not the way that we always think of it. They certainly are there to learn and not just to earn. And that's, so that's something I like to acknowledge. And then a measure of student learning alone, we all know that when you really dig into most grading systems, it's not just about what they've learned. Sometimes it has to do with whether it was timely in terms of submission of the work and other factors as well. And then a reliable indicator of future success. There are actually studies on this, and there's some that kind of contradict each other. We know, for example, high school GPA is a very strong predictor historically of performance in college, even better than like standardized tests like ACT and SAT. And many people assume that that's because the high school GPA is a measure of students' study habits and some of those habits of the mind that are likely to lead to them being successful in the next level, right? But when we actually dig into GPA from undergraduate into the workplace and other contexts in their society, we don't have nearly as strong of a correlation between high GPA and how much they're thriving in these other contexts. Okay, so what does a grade tell you about your progress? I guess I'm proposing that it doesn't necessarily tell us as much as maybe we need. So we're going to dive in and look at some other stuff here. So formative summative assessment, let's just quick little one-on-one. Those in Ann Arbor, you heard this before. But the way I represent formative assessment, it's the checkup at the doctor. Summative assessment is the autopsy, right? Formative assessment is, the checkup is where you go and they check your blood pressure and maybe they do a blood test to see if everything is in balance or whatever. They might check your weight. They ask you some questions. They're trying to find out how you're doing. And as a result of that, the doctor will usually maybe make some recommendations. Maybe you need a prescription. Maybe you need to go on a walk every day. Maybe you need to change your diet a little bit. Or maybe it's just keep doing what you're doing. I just had a really cool test that I believe says to me that I can eat whatever I want for the next 10 years, but I don't know if my doctor agrees. Anyway, that's the checkup, and the checkup is meant to help you improve the quality of your health, right? It's formative in nature. But the autopsy plays a very, very different role, right? The autopsy, no matter how thorough the assessor is, it does absolutely nothing to improve the quality of life of that person on the table, right? It's meant for future use. Maybe can we learn something from this that might be able to inform our practice or our work with other people, or it's data that we collect that we use for public health assessments or things like that. What's that? Crime investigation too. Yeah, we can find the cause of death, right? Exactly. And so I would argue that a lot of the assessments that we do in classes that are kind of like, they just add up to the final grade in the class, that they play more of a summative role. And what I'm suggesting is maybe we want to find some ways to fit a little more of the checkup experience into our classes. I think I believe that that's something that can get us closer to a culture of learning. Low stakes versus high stakes is another way of representing the two. checking for understanding versus an adjustment, or just checking and documenting what's happened. Another way of representing formative summative. Practice versus the big event. Or and others play around with these three, for, as, and of. So assessment for learning, assessment as learning versus assessment of learning. Assessment of learning would be more summative in nature. What's happened? What's been learned? And I document it. Assessment for learning and as learning, that's really about helping students see their progress or their lack thereof, right? Creating ways for them to be able to figure out, am I on track or am I not? So what happens when formative assessment is absent? And I'll just kind of leave that. Yes.
Just a question about the comparing on
Mhm.
the slide there. I'm a big fan of formative assessment
Mhm.
and the checkup. I love the checkup. Will you be talking about convincing students the importance of the checkup? Because
Yeah.
sometimes if a grade isn't attached, they don't care.
Yeah, I definitely, absolutely. So as we go through this, I think that will come out, but if it doesn't, please bring it up again. So what happens when formative assessment is absent? Maybe in your own experience as a learner, or maybe what you've seen with learners in your own class. And there's really not much of an opportunity for you as the student or for these students to see, am I making progress or how am I making progress? What happens? I see 3 hands. You don't have to press
From
in.
my own experience, I think I, as a student, go down what road I think it is,
Mm-hmm.
and it may be much later that I find out that I wasn't quite on the right road.
Okay. So a little bit about what might feel like a wasted journey. Like, boy, I wish I would have known that I took a wrong turn 10 miles ago.
There are some students that will want the teacher to grade it before they grade it because they'll want to make sure they get the A when the summative assessment happens.
Okay. All right. Very good.
I think you also see repetition of the same mistakes being made over and over again.
Yeah, right. So we can find a little bit of a lack of progress happening, right? And it can certainly lead to frustration. Have you ever been in a situation, maybe even in a relationship, like a friendship or something like that, and you're just not connecting with that person, and you say things and they get frustrated or they get upset at you or they misunderstand, and it just keeps happening, and you can't get feedback from them. You don't really know, well, what did I say wrong, or how do we do something different? You want to have the feedback so you can adjust, but you're not getting it, right? And so students can sometimes experience the same thing. You've heard this one before, I'm sure, right? I studied all night for this test. I've studied for hours and hours for this test, and I still failed. I can't get this right. So it can even lead to a sense of despair. And I'm convinced that a lot of this has to do with there's a hoop jumping, but they're not really understanding the learning component, right? It's not clear to them.
Just on this thought, I think the question was, what happens when, as a professor, you give the feedback, the formative feedback, and then there's not correction on the student side of things? So really, you're just spinning your wheels, doing all the things that you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
You correct the grammar 500 times,
Mm-hmm.
and that student is going to submit another paper that does
Yes.
not have anything to do with correct grammar.
Yes, absolutely. Which I think we'll get at a little bit here. We can't certainly force someone to change, but I do believe that we can pursue some practices that will help that to happen. And the self-feedback mechanisms that we're going to talk about in a little bit can be very helpful with that. Okay, so feedback sources, by the way, whenever I talk to people and I start talking about adding feedback mechanisms in our classes, the first response from any teacher who's been in a classroom is, I only have so many hours in the day. I mean, you can tell me to just grade more and give more feedback, but I just have to take sleep away. That's the only space that I have. And so I often like to note there are many sources of feedback that we can leverage, upon which we can capitalize. Certainly instructor feedback is paramount and it's valuable because instructors have disciplinary expertise that some of these other sources don't have. So in other words, when you have, and I'll talk about this concept a little bit later, there's a limitation to self-feedback and peer feedback because those people are not experts. And when you're an expert or you have disciplinary expertise, you notice nuances that others don't notice. You have a greater sense of connections between what seem like disparate ideas, right? So there are a lot of pieces there that only an instructor or a person who has significant knowledge in the discipline can give that kind of feedback. So I'm not disregarding that. That's obviously critical. But then we can, with some work, we can implement some peer feedback tools, some ways that learners can start to give each other feedback. And we'll talk about that in a minute. There are ways in which learners can learn to check their own understanding a little bit, although this takes time. It's tedious, it's painful on both sides, the student and the instructor side. Computer-generated feedback, practice quizzes and things like that in Blackboard are actually very effective. There have been several studies to show this, that students get a greater sense of their progress and their learning, and it motivates them to come to the instructor for help, or at least they realize that they're not on track, so they know what they need to attend to further to prepare for a larger test or assessment. So practice quizzes can be easily added. Computer-generated and adaptive. Now, this is something that many of you don't have. Some of you are in fields where the textbook companies that you're using actually have these built. And adaptive would be, it's a quiz, and based upon how you perform, it adjusts the quiz so that it's bringing the concepts that you have not mastered. Those come back in quiz format more frequently for you. So it allows, so it's literally customized or personalized to your level of performance. And those of you in the health sciences, I know that the textbook companies have built a lot of these kinds of tools that are happening. In math education, there are some tools that are being used in this area. Language instruction, but it's on a pretty basic level that they're doing, I mean, like the Duolingo kind of apps and things like that. And Duolingo, by the way, if any of you know the app, that's like just basic language, mostly vocabulary types of stuff. But now they've opened up the software behind Duolingo. They've opened it up so that anyone can actually take Duolingo, like if you're teaching Greek or Hebrew or something like that, you could actually create a Duolingo for Koine Greek or classical Hebrew or something like that. Okay, so and then also people beyond the academy. So the idea that people could actually get feedback from outside of the school itself, where people are working on something and they go and they share it with a person out in the real world and get some feedback and some insight. And that works in some disciplines more than others. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now this one is more time consuming, but it's pretty powerful and it's incredible. Whenever I've done a couple of studies just to see its effectiveness. So narrative feedback is just what it sounds like. It's giving feedback in think of it more of a paragraph format or a narrative. You're talking to them. It's conversational. Could be even a story kind of format. And it can be, usually when we think of narrative feedback, it's in a written format, but it could actually be audio or video. Like there are tools available in Blackboard. Well, actually not in Blackboard, but you can use like YouTube or some other tools to create audio and video feedback. Our last learning management system actually did this better than our current one. But you're actually just having a conversation with him. We actually did a little study in online courses where we had some really great instructors face-to-face, but when they got online, the quality of their feedback was plummeting. They just weren't as responsive to students, and the amount of feedback they gave was far less than what they seemed to give in their face-to-face classes, and we thought, why? So we looked into it, and I don't know if you remember this, Margie, this was years ago. So we decided, Matt Sensen, who was here at the time, he built a little audio tool, and we found that some of those same instructors started giving really rich feedback when they could talk, because they had a strong skill. They were good communicators. These are the instructors you see hanging out in the BBC with students all the time, right? And so when we'd put them online, we'd strip them of one of their communication strengths, and now we added it back. And what we found is instructors they included examples within their feedback. They, the length of their feedback, just the amount of content that they shared with the students was greater. They tended to give more timely feedback. Oh, and there was a tone, so students could read it or could kind of understand the message behind the message. Students were more likely to use the feedback to improve future versions of their work. They were more likely to review the feedback multiple times as opposed to just kind of look for the grade and go on. So narrative feedback is something that probably relates to, maybe it's something that we're wired for. Maybe God created us this way. There's something about the power of narrative and story in terms of communication. But it's a rich description. It allows you to build rapport with the students even as you're giving them feedback, so you can sandwich the harsh feedback a little bit in a way that's more digestible. It resembles the kind of feedback you get outside of a school setting in many environments. It gives you these teachable opportunities, and you can even reference progress over time if you can recall it. If you have a large class, it's hard to remember this, but right within your feedback, you can say, this is great progress compared to the last work that you did. And you can even kind of compare and contrast their own work in the conversation. So this is a really neat way to actually teach them to think about their progress. A lot of times our feedback plans just don't have space for this though. Like, where is the time where we get to actually talk to them about their progress? And some of our schedules don't allow for us to actually sit one-on-one with every single student. And if we do, we can't do it that often just because we have a lot of students. But maybe we can do this for select projects or things like that in the course, especially if you try the audio one. You know, she's retired now, but Mary Hilgendorf, who used to be in our School of Education, she used to be amazing at this. She loved her iPad, and she found a way where students would submit their work, and she would just had an app on her iPad, and she would just talk to them in a very conversational tone. She has that, where was she from originally? South, in the South somewhere, right? She had this nice Southern tone to her voice too. So, what's that? Arkansas? Okay, there you go. And so very conversational, but quite substantive and very direct feedback to them about what they're doing well and what they're not. And she's building a relationship with them as well as she did it. So narrative feedback is one way. And I won't go into this in great detail, but you know, there are lots of different models. I argue that here are the sort of 5 strengths of narrative feedback. It allows you to give a rich description like storytelling, allows you to build that rapport like I mentioned, tone. You can critique with encouragement, which we know is a problem, right? Sometimes students see a grade or they get certain feedback and their brain just shuts down because they're frustrated or angry or sad or whatever else it might be. So in a narrative format, you have an ability to help manage that to some extent a little bit more. Resembles the feedback I talked about before, allows you to teach, and progress over time. So the attributes, I would say that if you're going to try this out, again, you only have so many hours in the day, but if you're going to try out, my 5 tips are simply, and I'll make this PowerPoint available, keep it conversational. So certainly you can be professional, but I tend to prefer to be able to write in first person and second person in this, where it's like my having a real conversation with the person. Keep the goal in mind. Sometimes our narrative feedback can meander, right? We fall into a Toni Morrison stream of consciousness style of writing, where it might be more helpful to stay a little bit more focused on what's the primary goal? What is it you really wanted them to master as a part of this work or this assignment? And I tend to always suggest too, when you're in narrative feedback, the goal is progress. You may not cover everything. So pick the 1 or 2 things that you want to draw their attention to the most, as opposed to overwhelming them with these 14 things that they need to improve. Narrative feedback allows you to just home in on 1 or 2 items. Make sure that your feedback stays focused on that goal. Include examples or illustrations. So this is a real power of narrative feedback, is it's not just telling them what they got or what they didn't get right, but you can actually reference things that allow them to dig into this further. And this is a huge and powerful tool for helping students to begin to internalize this concept. To get, Jason, what you were talking about before, this can be very powerful in helping them get past that idea of, okay, I gave them feedback, I'm giving them the form of feedback, they're not doing anything with it. If we package it in this format, we find that some students are able to take it to the next level. Again, we're not going to have a solution for every student. And then give them suggestions or tips. I suggest you go back and read this book again, or I suggest you go back and practice this activity again, and you can give them some tips on what to do next. I'm going to skip this one just for time's sake. All right, peer assessment is the next one. A lot of text up there. So peer assessment is obviously just this concept of learners giving one another feedback. It has some benefits, it has some limitations. Obviously one of the benefits is now they're getting feedback from someone other than you. so you can add some new feedback mechanisms with, and while you still get to sleep. But we have this limitation that, that I mentioned before. So with peer feedback, the attention to nuance is going to be lacking most of the time. The understanding of what's important and what's not important is also going to be lacking for students, especially if you're teaching an entry-level course. Maybe if it's a more advanced course, they've reached a level where they can do this better. The relationships between concepts will be limited, and the implications of elements, right? Those are 4 pieces that increased level of disciplinary expertise allow you to see, and it's completely evident to you, but they don't see it. They miss it, right? So that's, and I can't do anything about this. This is a reality. But there are some ways we can manage that in peer assessment. And here's what I would suggest. If you're going to try peer assessment, you can do it in many ways. I think the next slide gives a few ideas. One is, and this seems contrived at first, but if we're going to have them give feedback to one another, we have to teach them the vocabulary to use. This is where it seems contrived. And I've even gone so far as to say, as you give feedback to one another, I'd like you to make sure you use these 5 words, right? This is a vocabulary. It's part of how we talk about this, part of the discourse in our discipline in the field. I want you to use these words or phrases when you talk to one another. And what's kind of neat, by the way, is we're actually then giving them more practice to think disciplinarily when we do this. And you can wander around the room. If you do this in small groups or groups of 2 to 4, and they're each taking turns, they share something and they get feedback from their peers. You can wander around and give them feedback. I played around with this when I first came here. I would take audio recorders. I had 3 audio recorders, and I put them on tables, and I would record their conversations. And after the class, I would study to see how they gave peer feedback, to see if they were doing a good job. That was part of my scholarship. That was not like my standard teaching strategy. But it was really helpful for me, and that's when I learned this was, oh wow, they don't know what they're talking. They don't even know how to use the vocabulary. So I started, and then I would play around, and I would give them a handout and say, use these words when you talk to each other. And they thought it was a little contrived and funny, and some would, kind of mock it at first, but then they started to use it, and they started to get an understanding. Oh, this is how it works. They need to know, where their attention should reside. So be specific, be direct. Say, when you give feedback to one another, I'd like you to give feedback on this. Focus on this piece. So we direct them. Over time, this becomes less necessary. But when we first start, we have to be incredibly specific, and then we can always back off later. Students need the clear expectations, again, on what's your role. If I'm getting feedback, what am I supposed to do? If I'm giving feedback, what am I supposed to do? And not being afraid to actually do that. And by the way, you can involve students in this. You could even ask the question, what do you need from someone else who's giving you feedback? And you could write on the board or something, come up with a list of rules, shared rules in the class, and try it out. And then students need practice and modeling. So don't be afraid to do silly things like pull 2 chairs up front, have some people come up in the front of the class and practice giving feedback to one another in front of the class, and then everyone else assesses their giving feedback to one another. So it's a skill that has to be learned. A lot of people try peer feedback, but they don't teach peer feedback. So they try it and it doesn't work, but that's like saying, I tried to play Beethoven on the piano the first time I sat at a piano and it didn't work, so pianos don't work. Well, that's not true. You have to practice the piano to get to be able to play that music. And the same thing's true for peer feedback. Let me stop there and see what questions or thoughts emerge. Is this helpful at all? Yes, I see some nods. Some people are straight-faced, so that means like I'm being polite, but thanks for the free meal. Okay. Okay, well, let's keep going then. By the way, in terms of process, I didn't write this. I found this somewhere else. But when you're setting up opportunity for students to give each other peer feedback, lots of simple mechanisms. Like before, your role would be define the goals, select the groups, select the place. That doesn't matter for most contexts, so I'm going to skip it. And you set the agenda for the feedback. So you have to plan some of that out for them at first. And then during, your job is really to monitor and coach. Walk around, coach people, guide them, take notes on who's giving feedback well and who's not, and then afterward you can talk to people one-on-one and give them some tips, or you can do some teachable moments after the fact. That's the part that's a little bit hard for us, is it's not just giving the feedback right away. We do have to work on process a little bit to make this work. Okay, so the third one then is self-feedback, and this, I believe, is the holy grail when it comes to feedback. Our ultimate goal is we want learners to be able to self-assess. The problem is the same as before, though. We have that disciplinary expertise thing. You'll see my picture in a minute. The disciplinary element that I mentioned before is pressure as much as ever. Plus, there's the added difficulty of self-reflection. I don't always see the limitations of myself that other people can see. That's a reality. So for self-assessment, the key is creating mirrors in the class, creating opportunities for students to actually look and see what they look like. And that's where this image comes from. Imagine that, I wake up in the morning and I have a meeting and it's at the office, but it's by Skype because I'm meeting with someone in Germany. And I actually did. And I was meeting with a group of professors in Germany, and I was speaking on assessment. This didn't really happen, by the way, this particular picture. I made this up. But so I wake up late. My alarm doesn't go off. I wake up late. I run out to my car. I grab a banana on the way out and a bottle of water. That's my breakfast. And I get to the office. I turn on the computer. I'm ready to have my meeting with them. And I look in the screen, and lo and behold, that's what my hair looks like, right? So I'm grateful that the mirror gave me a glimpse that maybe I needed to run to the bathroom and push it down. Although, by the way, the women in Germany said that I look better that way than what my hair looks now. So I don't know what that means. So that's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to create these systems where people can actually see, oh, wow, that's what I look like right now, or that's where I am, so I can make some adjustments. That I think is more pleasing. They didn't agree. All right, so self-assessment. There are lots of different ways that we can go about doing this. I'm going to skip some of these for time's sake. But one simple way that we can get started with this is, because vocabulary and other things are so important, is we can create simple rubrics. So I'm going to ask you to evaluate your own work on the basis of this 10-point checklist. I'm going to create a simple rubric, and I'd like you to pay attention and try to self-assess. And then when maybe they self-assess, and they come to class and you do small groups, and then they have to get peer feedback, and they can kind of check their own self-assessment with the view of a peer. And then they're going to, on a third layer, they'll get feedback from you eventually. So now they have 3 levels of feedback on something. And it takes some time for them to learn this, but it can be effective. You can invite students to create the rubrics. That works better for some disciplines more than others. Depends on whether you're dealing with more kind of factual or objective data, or some that's more can be interpreted in multiple ways. Self-assessment can also work in the form of learning contracts. How many of you have used a learning contract before? Okay, I see some hands up. And you can do this on assignment level or entire course levels, where a learning contract is just what it sounds like. You're setting up a contract with the learner with certain expectations. And here's what you commit to do. Here's what I commit to do. Here's what the outcome will be. It can be a great way to help students build a sense of ownership in their classes. I'm going to skip the muddy point discussion now. A really great simple way is entry and exit tickets. How many of you have used these in your class? Okay, a few hands. An entry ticket is a quick self-check at the beginning of the class. Like, it might be that you expected them to do something prior to coming to the class because you wanted to come prepared. So you're essentially giving them like a 1-question quiz or something like that. And then at the end of the class, it could even be a simple sheet of paper where you want to check their understanding of a core concept. And you can have them fill it out. You can use this for self-assessment too, where they can actually, self-assess at the beginning of the class what level of confidence they have coming in, how well they think they know the content or some specific piece. The more specific, the better. And at the end of the class, you can do the same thing. 1-paragraph self-assessments with each submission or at the end of a discussion. Great way to get inside those wonderful and complex brains of our students is to have them tell you what they're thinking and what they're experiencing. And I'll skip that too. So I'm convinced that one of the reasons that our students don't have a strong sense of agency and ownership, though, is because sometimes we don't really give them that. Like, on the left-hand side, these are the roles of the teacher. But on the right-hand side, if we don't at least invite the students to ask these questions, at least in small ways, when appropriate in our class, we're going to fail to have a sense of ownership from the students, right? So what do I need or want to learn? Well, ultimately, they have to learn what's on the syllabus and what we have stated for them. But there's also some power in inviting them into asking these questions and setting up these goals. We're going to get some more buy-in. And how will I know when I've learned it? Actually, we're telling them, here's how you're going to be graded, but actually inviting or requiring students to have to think through this. How will you know when you've learned this? And have them reflect on that and to come up with a response for you and for themselves. How are they going to monitor their own progress? And how are they going to learn what they need to learn? So simply challenging students to ask these 4 questions and grapple with answers, and then they can workshop them with you and with classmates, that can go a long way in starting to teach them to think differently. I mentioned these before. I have the slide. You don't have to write all these down, but these are the kinds of questions that we want to get students asking. The more they're asking these kinds of questions, the more they're going to have some buy-in and a sense of involvement in their progress. I think I ran out of time here, so I'm going to jump ahead. Portfolio we didn't get to, so I'm going to have to just skip that one. But I will say this. This slide I'm just going to point out because it's a resource for you later. I have come up with just a few tips and ideas for people because whether you're doing self-assessment or peer feedback or any of these others, rubrics are a really powerful way of keeping our feedback focused, right? How many of you use rubrics in your class right now? Most of you in the room, right? Okay, good. So these are just some simple tips for students. And the third bullet point is one that I found really valuable. It helps students start to make a shift away from that whole grade concept, right? So if we have in a narrative format broken up their level of learning using some other kind of vocabulary like mastery, partial mastery, progressing, emerging, or exceeds expectations, meets. I actually like the first one more than the second because it's focused more on their learning and less on my assessing. This is a great way to help them begin to think about this idea of, well, how am I developing? And it moves away from just, have I gotten the grade? So there's a lot there. I know I just kind of dove in and poured a bunch of ideas out with you. We're at the end of our time. If some of you have time and you want to stick around and we can do a little Q&A, that's great. But if you have to leave, I understand that too. All right. Any comments or questions as we finish up here?